China has managed to minimize deaths and infections for the Chinese people as much as they can. And China has the lowest rate of infections and deaths. To this extent, I think China has all the reasons to be very proud of its great success.
Protests are spreading across China. This was in the financial hub Shanghai last night. The protests began as action against tough COVID policies, but now they seem to be directly critical of the Chinese regime and even President Xi himself. The fear is that a crackdown can't be far away. Let's talk to Victor Gao. He's the Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization in Beijing. He's often spoken to us to give us an understanding of the Chinese government's perspective. Good morning to you, Victor.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great pleasure. What have you made of these protests?
First of all, it is very rare for a massive protests to take place in multiple cities in China. Therefore, I do believe that the Chinese government authorities will need to analyze the situation very carefully and do their best to heed the legitimate demands as expressed in many of these protests. On the other hand, the protests are very much focused on calling for lifting of the restrictive measures as part of the dynamic zero COVID policy that China has been pursuing for 3 years. We need to be philosophical about this policy. On the one hand, China has managed to minimize deaths and infections for the Chinese people as much as they can, and China has the lowest rate of infections and deaths. To this extent, I think China has all the reasons to be very proud of its great success. On the other hand, the policy has also resulted in a lot of pain and suffering and inconvenience for people who are subject to lockdowns or quarantines, etc. And the people do have a legitimate reason to believe that it is time for the government to lift many of these restrictive measures to make sure that life can be normalized, work process can be normalized. And I think the government will also heed the demands in this regard to make the restrictive measures more flexible going forward. On the other hand, allow me to emphasize that after the successful conclusion of the 20th Party Congress in October, China is very united as a country, and to maintain peace and stability going forward is the megatrend for China. Therefore, I truly believe the protests have more or less calmed down and their voices have been heard by the government. And I do hope the government will take immediate and very prompt actions to address many of the legitimate concerns. Yeah. And also people at large would also need to realize that the COVID policies are not only for our own health, but also for the health of the whole nation as a whole.
But will the government need to accept in that very balanced response of yours, Victor Gao, that actually this COVID policy is fundamentally wrong? China is an outlier when it comes to, and it may have done a good job protecting its citizens during the bulk of the crisis, but China has to accept it has very poor vaccination rates, and therefore it struggles to deal with the long-term effects of China. And maybe the government, which is not well known for autocracies like the Chinese government, to hold their hands up and say, this is a mistake, we have made some mistakes, we need to change for the benefit of our citizens.
Well, with due respect to your questions, I would tend to disagree to a very large extent. First of all, there's no denying that for the past 3 years, China has delivered the lowest death rate and infection rate for the people. To that extent, I think all of us here in China are grateful that millions of people have been saved, hundreds of millions of people have been prevented from infections. That's for sure. Now, you also mentioned that the economic cost. Of course, there are economic costs for China's dynamic zero COVID policy, but the Chinese government deliberately accepted these costs because they paid a higher premium for saving lives for the Chinese people. For us in China, life is the most important part of human rights. Without life, you lose all the rights you talk about.
But when will it end, Victor? I mean, the point is that's a very laudable position, and not everyone who's experienced the might of the Chinese government will recognize its respect for life. But the point is, you can't hold off forever. You can't keep the door shut forever, can you? That's the problem that citizens are complaining about.
I agree. I think this is exactly why I emphasize that China is in this transition period. The original paradigm is to save people from deaths of infections and infections themselves. Now we need to achieve two goals. We still need to minimize deaths and infections on the one hand, but also we need to restore normalcy to daily life and also economic activities. How to strike a more better equilibrium point in between these two goals, that's the challenge for China. I think China is already in the middle of this transition, and patience will be required for people in affected regions in China, and also understanding on the part of foreign countries will also be very, very much appreciated. I'm sure China will be able to make this transition successfully with minimum deaths and infections for the Chinese people, and also economy being restored to normalcy, lives being restored to normalcy.
Victor Gao, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
That's Victor Gao there. And you can just hear the sense, though, that the Chinese government may be on the bend a little bit. We'll see if that happens over the next few days or not.